Thank you for speaking with me, Dustin. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of APTC's recent research on IT risks in the supply chain. Can you tell me a little bit about APTC's recent IT risk in the supply chain research study? Absolutely, Dustin. Supply chain risk is a cause of growing concern for organizations, and although high-impact natural disasters often grab headlines, we've often seen that in the news, organizations are also concerned by IT risk that can impact systems supporting, day-to-day operations within complex global supply chains. IT has actually been found to be one of the biggest unmanaged supply chain risks. Potential IT risk in supply chain have promoted CIOs and supply chain managers to often work together to address the issues that are occurring today. The primary focus of the research that we conducted at APTC was to identify the IT risk supply chain organizations were experiencing. We looked at the level of concern for the various IT risk factors, how controllable organizations were finding the disruptions they were experiencing, and the practices organizations were using to ensure supply chain resiliency in light of potential IT disruptions. For this study, we surveyed senior executives working in supply chains and IT at 118 organizations in a variety of industries and variety of organization sizes, of course. What was one of the most shocking or eye-opening findings revealed from this research study? Well, Dustin, there were many interesting findings from the study, but the results from our survey reveal that many organizations have been affected by IT disruptions like technology changes, unplanned IT and telecommunication outages, counterfeiting, and cyber attacks. And while they have experienced those disruptions, the leaders at these organizations, they were concerned about the risk. However, the respondents indicated that their organizations occasionally use IT risk management practices, and that they find the practices to be only somewhat effective. And this is not necessarily a positive finding. When you're having these type of disruptions, and you have little faith in the practices that are occurring because they haven't been extremely effective. They've been only somewhat effective. It's a cause for concern. What are the most used IT risk management practices that organizations are using? Well, Dustin, based on our survey research, the three most frequently used IT risk management practices organizations are using include having a standardized process for pre-qualifying suppliers. That was the first one and the most frequently used. The second one was the use of an enhanced perimeter defense system to detect intrusions, and this was really big for helping with cybersecurity issues. And the third, also dealing with cybersecurity, involves corporate-wide capabilities in cybersecurity and emergency response. So how quickly organizations were going about responding to the risk, and that was, again, enterprise-wide. There were also the practices that were rated most effective by responses. And while these were rated most effective, I encourage organizations to continue to look for new and effective ways of managing risk and evaluating their practices to make sure that they continue to be relevant, especially when it comes to thinking about cyber attacks and counterfeiting. Because every day there are new methods of attack that are being created. And you have to be on top of your game at your organization in order to mitigate those risks and to identify and mitigate those risks. How often are organizations evaluating their supply chain resiliency and possible exposure to IT risk? That's a good question, Dustin. APTC survey asked respondents to indicate how frequently their organizations evaluate their supply chain's resiliency and exposure to risk, to IT risk more specifically. And only 40% of organizations evaluate their supply chain resiliency and exposure to risk at least every 12 months. And that really puts 60% of organizations at greater risk. You really should be evaluating your supply chain resiliency on an annual basis. That is our recommendation. That's what we've seen organizations who really manage IT risk well, what they're doing. The survey data also reveals some interesting results for organizations that conduct the evaluations more frequently. So respondents from organizations that evaluated resiliency every month to every 12 months indicated that their leadership is more concerned about disruption risk factors than respondents from organizations that evaluated resiliency less frequently. This higher concern that we see may be the motivation for these organizations to conduct more regular evaluations of the resiliency of their supply chains and their exposure to risk. And something else that we saw, respondents from these organizations also believe that IT risk factors are more controllable than do respondents from organizations conducting less frequent evaluations. And, that may be that the organizations with more frequent evaluations respond this way because they have a better idea of their risk for potential IT disruptions, as well as the ways that they can best minimize the effects of any disruption. It's extremely important to have an idea of the risk potential. And I'm going to talk about that more a little bit later, but organizations really need to know the potential that exists there. What steps can organizations take to help them better manage IT risk? Well, Dustin, we get asked this question all the time, whether it's IT risk or any other type of risk. So what steps can organizations take? Well, specifically for IT risk, our research has found that organizations often have an IT risk management plan or program, but those plans don't necessarily cover the entire spectrum of risk and are not aligned to the enterprise strategy. And they have to be aligned in order for it to be effective and in order for it to work well. So if an organization really wants to manage that IT risk and the potential for disruption, it really needs to be aligned throughout the enterprise. Through our research and talking to several organizations, we have identified several steps organizations can take to help them better manage these IT risk in the supply chain. And the first really is to identify the needs of your organization. You really have to identify what it is that your organization truly needs. The second is to identify the internal and external environment to get a better sense of how information flows in and out of the supply chain, and who has access to that information. Because who has access can also impact your security. And once that has been done, the organization can assess its current situation and identify the potential risks that need to be addressed by the risk management program. And as organizations go through the process of identifying risk, they can begin to understand the outcomes that they are hoping to achieve from the risk management program based on the needs they identified in the beginning. The needs have to be, as I mentioned earlier, aligned so that the organization can understand how to address the identified risk through the program. And organizations then have to make sure that they have a plan in place to continuously review and monitor the risk management program. If organizations don't review and monitor their program, it's going to open them up to exposure of additional unforeseen risks. The goal for organizations really should be to identify and to monitor and contain IT risk before they have a chance to even reach the supply chain and impact business operations. Risks are out there. The better an organization can actually prevent it from hitting the supply chain, it's essential because it can be detrimental to a supply chain. A clear IT risk management program that takes into account the needs of the business can result in the identification of potential risk and the ability to manage those risks. I'd also like to add one last thing, that it's important that supply chain management and IT management groups collaborate to help identify and control risk. As I mentioned earlier, CIOs and supply chain management professionals are coming together, and our research indicated that the majority of organizations, it was about 70% of them, reported at least adequate collaboration between their organization's supply chain management and IT management groups. So I think the more that these two groups are communicating, I think the better you will see the control and the management of the risk and the ability to identify those risks. So I would urge organizations to make sure that their needs have been identified, that they are identifying their risk, and that they are communicating both with both the IT and supply chain groups. Dustin, I appreciate the opportunity that you've given me today to speak with everyone about our research on IT risk in the supply chain. I look forward to more conversations in the future on other supply chain topics, and I appreciate your time. Just to share more with your audience, to see more of the research that we're conducting on the state of IT risk management in the supply chain and some of our other supply chain topics, please visit www.apqc.org, and please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you.